Hello and welcome to today's lecture on the fur trade era. The fur trade era marks the next phase in the history of the Pacific Northwest, and more importantly, the next phase in the growing encroachment by Europeans and Americans into territory and lands that belong to indigenous peoples. The fur trade era takes place from roughly 1786, 1789, when John Mears comes out here. We talked about John Mears in the exploration lectures, but he's also basically a fur trader. And so it takes place from the time John Mears comes out here, 1786, 1789, when he comes back, all the way until the 1840s and 1850s. So in this lecture, we're covering quite a few really critically important decades. Before we start talking about the fur trade itself, which will be the subject of this particular lecture. I've divided the fur trade era into two different lectures. The first lecture is really just about the economics of the fur trade, the business of the fur trade, how it functions, and the role it plays in the global economy, and which countries are involved in the fur trade, and so on and so forth, because that's a really important concept to grasp for understanding what happens during the fur trade era. But so this lecture will be about that. In the next lecture, we'll talk about fur trading companies and countries that were involved and start progressing the story a little bit further. But this era is very critical for two important reasons. And I just want to outline them for you before we move forward. The first is what I alluded to just moments ago. The fur trade era is a significant change in the relationship between the indigenous peoples, the tribes that we discussed, and the cultures we discussed in Unit 1. It's a significant change in their relationship with white Europeans and white Americans. And the reason for that is the nature of the fur trade. As I have talked about in previous lectures, the impact of European and American culture had reached the Pacific indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest long before the actual European and American explorers reached this region. We talked about how through trading networks, goods that were of American or European origin were in the trading networks of the coastal tribes and the plateau tribes. We talked about the horse with respect to the plateau tribes, how the horse arrived in the 1700s and radically changed and transformed plateau culture and plateau life. And so by the time the explorers get out here and start having sustained contact with indigenous peoples, they're already feeling the impact of transformations and changes that have been introduced into the North American continent. And then explorers come. And as I mentioned in the explorers lecture, overall, for the most part, the exploration era was an era of of relatively little conflict. Mostly indigenous peoples traded with and assisted explorers and when they from the United States and Europe when they came out here, when they came out to the Pacific Northwest, mostly they assisted them, helped them, and traded with them. That's not to suggest there was never any conflict. Our primary source material, which is largely records from explorers, indicate that there were moments of conflict. But overall, the record seems to indicate fairly positive relationships, relationships based on trade. But one key thing you have to understand about explorers is they didn't stay here. Lewis and Clark might have camped for months at a time in certain areas to winter, or days or weeks at a time to gather supplies. But they weren't permanent residents encroaching upon indigenous land. The explorers like James Cook or Manuel Quimper or Juan Perez or any of the other explorers, they came, they traded, they left. they did not create settlements that encroached upon indigenous lands. The only permanent European settlement in the Pacific Northwest at the time of the fur trade era begins is Nootka Village on Vancouver Island. And it's a very, very small, originally a Spanish community, and then later essentially overseen by the British. It's a fairly small settlement with a fairly low population. There are some other smaller little settlements that sometimes are mentioned in the primary source record and sometimes have actually been discovered by archaeologists and we didn't know anything about them. But the overall footprint of non-indigenous peoples is really, really small. As a consequence, indigenous peoples don't feel under threat by the arrival of Europeans and Americans. But the fur trade era is going to change that, because the fur trade era requires, in some form, permanent settlement in the area. The fur trade industry requires fur traders and fur trappers from European places and the United States to physically be occupying lands in the Pacific Northwest. And that is going to alter the relationship with indigenous peoples. It also sets the stage for other settlements. And we'll talk about other settlements in subsequent units, like missionaries, and later pioneers and homesteaders and farmers and miners. So the fur trade era is of enormous consequence because it begins physical settlement by non-indigenous peoples, and it starts what will be waves of immigration throughout the 19th century. The second reason that the fur trade era is so significant, and I want you to be aware of this, is because the fur trade era will push the story forward of what country will claim the territory of the Pacific Northwest. We've talked about this competition among countries for control of the Pacific Northwest. We've talked about Spanish claims to the Pacific Northwest, Russian claims to the Pacific Northwest, British claims to the Pacific Northwest, and American claims to the Pacific Northwest. We've talked about the claims of those four countries, all making a claim to the Pacific Northwest. What will happen during the fur trade era is the fur trade era will weed out two of those countries, because the fur trade companies who are here in the Pacific Northwest are British and American, and their occupation will add to their claims for this region and will effectively push out both Russia and Spain. Now, this is just your reminder of something I've mentioned numerous times, but must be mentioned here again. None of these countries considered the indigenous peoples to have the rights to their ancestral homelands. Native American tribes were not considered as legitimate occupants of the lands that they had lived on for centuries upon centuries upon centuries upon centuries. And that's really important to keep in mind. Okay, so that is the opening framing narrative. This is the big picture about why the fur trade era is so important. Now, let's talk a little bit about the business of the fur trade, because the business of the fur trade is really, really important to understand. So, a brief history of fur trade in North America, okay? A brief history of fur trade in North America. The first thing you need to know is that the fur trade had been in North America for a very, very, very long time. In fact, the fur trade was one of the first economic industries undertaken by English and Dutch and French colonies in North America. In particular, the northern English colonies and the Dutch colonies like in New York, and the French colonies in what is now Canada and the Great Lakes area. They were heavily active in the fur trade industry. It was one of the first economic activities that they engaged in for profit. And the reason for that is that the fur trade was a global economic industry. It was a global enterprise. The types of fur pelts that they were looking for were primarily beaver and otter pelts. Primarily beaver and otter pelts. And we'll talk more about this in just a moment. But primarily beaver and otter pelts. There were other animals as well, but beaver and otter were the most highly sought after, the most highly desirable. Beaver had existed in Europe, but by the time the English colonies and the Dutch colonies and the French colonies were established, by the time those colonial enterprises were underway, so in the 1600s and the 1700s, beaver and other fur-bearing animals had largely died out, or their populations were so small that having a robust fur industry wasn't possible in Europe. And so North America became a new land to exploit this resource. And the reason this was such a lucrative economic industry was because of the market. It was because of the market. When you sold furs, you had two markets in which they were in high demand. The first market was Europe or urban colonial centers like a Boston or a city in the colonies. So you either all throughout Europe or some of the colonial cities. That's one market for these goods, because these could be turned into all sorts of fashion items, particularly hats. Particularly hats these were used for, but all sorts of fashion items, and they were in high demand. So you could sell the pelts for a really good profit to be turned into other clothing or accessories in Europe or the urban centers of the colonial era, particularly like English or colonial urban settings like Boston. But the second and the most lucrative market was taking these fur pelts to Asia, particularly to China. I've mentioned this before in the exploration lectures, but I just want you to be aware of how large China looms in this global economic story. And I don't think that's often appreciated by not just the general public, but even people who have studied history. China looms large here because China was the source of so many goods that were considered luxurious and exotic within Western societies, particularly Europe. China had high quality silk that was in high demand. They had tea, which was in high demand. They had spices that were in high demand, or they could acquire those spices. A lot of them weren't actually cultivated in China, but China could acquire them and then sell them to Western merchants. There was also porcelain. Porcelain's a kind of pottery with a very fine, smooth finish. And there had been imitators of porcelain throughout Europe, but no one had managed to do it in a way as well as the Chinese. And the Chinese empires, and there were several of them from the moment porcelain was invented in the Sung dynasty. The various dynasties and empires of China, they had closely guarded the secret of porcelain and how to produce it. And this porcelain was highly, highly desired. If you were to travel to Europe and visit places like Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle or all sorts of places on the European continent, and you would inevitably end up in these quote unquote China rooms where there would be these dining sets, and they were literally called China. Well, the reason they were called China is because the porcelain came from China. But you would go there and you'd find all these elaborately highly decorated porcelain sets, and all of them originated in China, or the vast majority of them did. hence the term China for fine dining sets because of that. And so this stuff was highly desired in Europe, and wealthy Europeans paid for this material stuff. And even your sort of middle class Europeans and lower class Europeans would pay for spices and tea. So there was a real large market for the commodities of China. But the problem is that when merchants went to China, they wanted to barter. They wanted to exchange good for good. They wanted to say, hey, we have these goods that we produce in Europe, and we can produce them relatively cheaply, and we want to trade it for these high luxury goods that we can't produce in Europe and turn around, take them back to Europe, and sell them for high profit. And this had been the business model that Europeans and Americans had done with peoples in Africa or indigenous peoples throughout the Americas, in North and South America and the Caribbean, is you take goods that Europeans produce relatively inexpensively, metalwork, pottery, fabric, all weapons, alcohol, what have you. Could be any number of things, but whatever it is, it was acquired relatively inexpensively by the merchants, and they would exchange it for things like fur pelts or gold or something else that was of high value to Europeans. And then they'd either have that value or have that commodity, in the case of the gold, and be wealthy, or they would go and take whatever item they acquired and flip it in Europe for a profit. But China didn't play by those rules because China didn't want anything that Europe produced. China had an insular culture that didn't really value the rest of the world very much. In fact, China had a conception of itself as the center of the world. The Chinese didn't call their country China. That's what the West called it. They called themselves the Middle Kingdom. Well, what does the Middle Kingdom mean? The kingdom at the center of the universe. They were the center of the universe, and everything radiating out from China was inferior. It was barbaric. And the further away you went from China, the further you were from the bright center of the universe, which was China, and so you were, by extension, lesser. So they just didn't want anything that was produced in these areas. They had some of the most sophisticated manufacturing on the planet, and they're incredibly wealthy. They didn't want anything that the West had, so they said, pay with your silver, pay with your gold, or else you're not getting these commodities. And that cut into the profits of merchants. But furs were different. The furs that you could acquire in North America, those were things that China did not have access to. And so they were interested in trading for that commodity. And so you could take furs to Asia and exchange them for tea and silk and spices and porcelain, and then turn around and sell those for enormous profits in the colonies or in Europe itself. And that's this global trade network. So that's the global trade network, or the fur trade. And it was one of the most important industries in colonial North America. But what happens is that over-trapping means that these animals get trapped out in sort of the East Coast area of North America where the fur trade starts. And fur traders have to go further and further inland looking for these animals. And by the time we get to the 19th century, the fur trade is largely concentrated in the Great Lakes area. So it's largely concentrated in the Great Lakes area. But with the exploration of James Cook and his very, very famous line in his journals that says the Pacific Northwest is filled with fish, furs, and forests, the word is out that there's a new source for fur-bearing animals and for the pelts that you can acquire. And there's this idea that if you get out here, you've got a new source for this material. And the two groups most interested in getting out here are British and American companies. We'll talk about that in the next lecture, but just as a preview. Now, before we move on to more details of the Western fur trade, I think it's important to spend a few moments talking about the native peoples and their role in the fur trade. Because native peoples had their own fur trade prior to the arrival of Europeans. And then once Europeans and Americans, fur trappers and fur traders, insert themselves into this, native peoples participate in that fur trade as well. So the fur trade is not new to the Pacific Northwest, right? It didn't just show up because white fur trappers and fur traders showed up. Rather, it had been here for centuries. Indians in the Pacific Northwest were active in the fur trade among themselves. They were trading these animals, the pelts of these animals among themselves, and with trading networks that went outside the Pacific Northwest. One thing to keep in mind is there's a misconception about indigenous peoples in North America, as if they were somewhat isolated from the rest of North America, and they only had interaction with the members of their own tribe and bands and villages, and maybe a few of the neighboring tribes, bands, and villages. That's not true. We've already seen that groups like the Nez Perce, once they got the horse, went all the way to the Great Plains to hunt buffalo and had relationships with Plains Indians. There were trading networks across North America. And what that meant is goods from various parts of North America would wind their way to other parts of North America. And one thing that is a universal truism in world history is where there's trade, ideas, information, and gossip move along trading routes. So knowledge moves across trading routes. That's why when white European and American explorers show up in the Pacific Northwest, none of the native peoples are shocked because they've never seen a white person before. Well, they may not have ever seen one before, but they knew of their existence because trade and information passed along these trade lines. So furs from the Pacific Northwest could make their way all over North America through these trade routes, right? And the geography of the Pacific Northwest is it's a great habitat for the fur-bearing animals, particularly for the beaver and the otter, which were most desirable. And indigenous peoples made use of these animals for clothing and other items. And then, of course, they traded with them. But one thing you need to be aware of with respect to Indian fur trapping and fur trade is that their view of this was much more sustainable. Native peoples understood that they had to be careful with respect to the resources found in their territory. You couldn't overhunt, overfish, overgather without risking future harvests and the future livelihood and life of your tribal members. So as a consequence, native peoples were more sustainable with their resources. They simply had to be. And with respect to the fur trade, what that meant is most native peoples practiced restraint when trapping fur-bearing animals. They didn't gather all the animals that they could. They gathered the animals that were necessary for that moment. And they prioritized not trapping mothers and their young because they were trying not to get the next generation. What that meant is that their trapping was a little bit more burdensome because they couldn't simply just trap to kill everything. They had to be selective. But it was what they needed to do to make sure the resource would continue to be there. That's not how European and American fur trappers trap. They're trapping purely for profit, and they're going to get all the profit they can, all the animals that they can, and then move on. And that's already happened in the northeastern part of North America. That's why they've had to move inland to the Great Lakes. So just keep that difference in mind, okay? It's also important to understand and this will be abundantly clear in the later in this lecture and in the next lecture. Indians play a large role in the fur trade when American and British fur trading companies arrived in the Pacific Northwest. They are the primary supplier of fur pelts. They're also the ones who taught white fur trappers the places and techniques for acquiring these animals. So they play a very important role. Briefly, let's just discuss the animals of the fur trade. There are three primary animals desirable in the fur trade. You can see them on this slide. On the top left, you have the beaver. So on the top left, you have the beaver. That was the most highly desirable pelt, and the Pacific Northwest was filled with beaver. They were found all over the western part of the territory, in rivers, lakes, ponds, and coastal areas. In the eastern part of the territory, even though it's a desert, they could be found up in the mountains, on mountain lakes and mountain rivers and streams, but they could also be found in the lowland areas. Anywhere where there was a major river, lake, pond, or stream, beavers could be found. The next two animals were both otter. So on the top right, you have the sea otter. As the name implies, the sea otter lives in marine environments, in coastal saltwater environments. So you found the sea otter in the Puget Sound, in the Straits of Juan de Fuca, along the Pacific coast of Washington and Oregon. That's where you found the sea otter. Inland, along rivers and streams, both in eastern and western parts of the Pacific Northwest, you found the river otter. Same animal, different species, but both pelts were highly, highly desirable. All right, to conclude today's lecture, we need to talk about the components of the fur trade. What was the fur trade made up of? Okay, what were its components? What were the parts of it? Okay, it's a large international industry, but it consists of many components. Component number one is the animal. The fur trade can only thrive where the animals of the industry are found. Okay, so this is an industry that requires you to be on site where the animals are, to have individuals in the area to acquire these animals. So that's component number one. Component number two are the fur trappers. These are the people who live in the region and procure the pelts. In many cases, the fur trappers were native peoples. They were native peoples who already trapped these animals and had these pelts, and they simply, instead of trading with other indigenous peoples, they're now going to trade with representatives from European and American fur companies. But fur trappers might also be white fur trappers who moved out here. White fur trappers from America, white fur trappers from places in Europe who moved out to the Pacific Northwest. Now, these fur trappers had to tread carefully because they were usually single and solitary. They were usually single men, and they were coming into indigenous territory. So oftentimes they had to work with indigenous peoples, or they had to trap in areas where indigenous peoples weren't, or at least they weren't during, certain parts of the year. So you have situations where they're trapping up in the mountains during times of year when indigenous peoples aren't up there, or trapping along rivers and streams when indigenous peoples aren't there. So you could get two different kinds of fur trappers. And then you have the fur traders. The trappers were largely either indigenous peoples, and the majority of the trappers were indigenous peoples, especially early in the fur trade. But if the trappers were white men from America or from European countries, they were freelancers. They weren't necessarily employees of companies. They could be, but many of them were freelancers. They trapped the pelts, they processed them, and then they took them to a fur trader to sell or barter for goods. So a fur trader was the next component, and the fur trader was an employee and representative of a fur trading company. So they were an employee or a representative of a fur trading company. They worked for one of the companies and they had a stockpile of goods, and then they established values. How much was a pelt worth in terms of goods? And the goods were might be food items, metal items, alcohol, weapons, guns, knives, ammunition, so on and so forth. So they had a stockpile of goods. The fur trappers, whether they were indigenous or non-native, would come in and they would haggle over the price, and then the fur trader would acquire the pelts, and then they have to send the pelts elsewhere. So they acquire them and they send them elsewhere. Most of the fur trader's business is done at fur trading posts, physical locations like forts, where the fur trader is located and they have the stockpile of all the goods that they're going to barter for the pelts, and where they can store the pelts until they're sent out to be sold at market. So most of this took place at actual fur trading posts. There are exceptions. In particular, there's one fur trading company called the Rocky Mountain Company that uses something called a rendezvous, which is just a set location at a set time where everyone's going to meet and trade. They're not maintaining physical structures like forts, but for the most part, almost all the companies used forts. So forts are physical structures on land that belongs to indigenous peoples. So you have to have the permission of indigenous peoples to have a fort there. For the most part, this wasn't a problem. Indigenous peoples actually welcomed these forts because they wanted access to goods that American and European companies provided. So they were more than willing to allow for these forts. Now, not all tribes were like this, but a lot of the tribes not only wanted them, they recruited them. They begged fur trading companies to establish forts in their territories because they wanted access to those goods via trade, and they were willing to set aside part of the land that they lived on for that. What's really important about this is this creates unreasonable expectations among white people that indigenous peoples are welcoming them out to settle. That's a total misunderstanding of what's going on here. Indigenous peoples want them there because they see value in having these fur trading posts, not because they necessarily enjoy having these people live among them. And it's going to be a real shock for missionaries and homesteaders when they decide to settle on indigenous land and native peoples don't want them there. They see it as theft and usurpation. Well, the reason for that is they don't see any value coming from missionaries or coming from these homesteaders like the fur trading posts. Just important to keep that in mind. Now, in terms of the location of the fur trading posts, it has two requirements. One is pretty obvious: an Indian tribes interested in trade. If indigenous tribes are not interested in trade, then there's no point in having a fur trading post there. You're not going to do any business. So you have to have that. But that's fairly self-evident. The other factor you need to consider in the placement of your fur trading post is a water route. Overland travel is exceedingly difficult in the Pacific Northwest in the early 19th century. To acquire a bunch of fur pelts would require you to have wagons to carry to transport them, and there are no wagon paths in the Pacific Northwest at this time. And just moving the wagons across eastern Washington is very, very difficult and impossible in some places, and it's flat out and this is true in eastern Oregon as well, and it's flat out impossible in western Washington and western Oregon because of the heavy forestation. So all transportation of the pelts and the goods that you're bartering for the pelts, that all has to take place on waterways. So you need to locate your fur trading post, not just where there are indigenous peoples willing to trade with you, but where you have navigable waterways to move goods in and out. So the most famous fur trading post ever in the Pacific Northwest was a place called Fort Vancouver. And it was near where Vancouver, Washington is. And Fort Vancouver, it 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 was located along the confluence of the Willamette and the Columbia rivers. So it was at the very end of all the major waterways in Oregon and Washington. It was the perfect place for goods to come to and be sent out. And that was true for every fur trading post. You wanted to put it where things could move in and out and be accessible. All right, that is a look at the fur trade, the business of it, and the big picture conception of why it's so important to the history of the Pacific Northwest. In the next lecture, we'll talk about individual fur trading companies and how they advanced the claims of the British and the Americans to the Pacific Northwest. All right, I thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.